Good morning. Welcome back to Studio B again. Here we are continuing in our look at the Gospel of John, and we are getting down towards the tail end of chapter 1 finally, but we're discovering a lot of remarkable things about this Gospel and about the events that surrounded it. Most importantly, as I encouraged you this past week, try to imagine yourself in those situations, in those settings, witnessing those events, feeling those same emotions, being astounded as we work our way through the books and we see these remarkable things that Jesus does and we hear the remarkable things that Jesus says. So let yourself be brought into the text, because that's the desire that the Apostle John has, is that we identify with those men as they're getting to know Jesus. And that's what we're seeing happen right now. So here's where we are. We're still in the wilderness. Remember, this began as the ministry of John the Baptist. On day one, the Baptist fields some inquiries. Some Jews have come out from Jerusalem to ask him about his ministry and to challenge him as to its validity and its purpose. On day 2, Jesus comes by. John identifies Jesus. John the Baptist identifies Jesus for those who are present. And John the Baptist then gives his testimony, and he recalls the time that he had actually baptized Jesus, and particularly he dwells upon the fact that the Holy Spirit descended in the form of a dove and came to rest on Jesus and remained on him. Okay, and so this was, as we talked last week, this was actually a physical form of an anointing by the Holy Spirit, in addition to all of its spiritual meaning. Okay, last week we began to talk about day 3, where Jesus began making some disciples, and we talked about those first 3 disciples. We talked about Andrew, we talked about John the Apostle, and we talked about Andrew's brother, Simon, who came to be known as Cephas or Peter. Okay, and that's where we got to last week. Now today we're going to pick up with just a couple of additional thoughts from day 3. Just a couple of things that I want you to notice in the text here. And these are a little bit technical, but I think they're important things for us to go over. First of all, I want you to notice, and of course we're dealing with John chapter 1, we're dealing with the section between verses 35 and 42. All right? The first of these couple of things that I want you to notice is that the Apostle John provides some translation assistance. And this is stuff that's actually written into his text. So as he's writing this down at the end of the first century, he actually writes this stuff in, and he does it 3 times. He gives the reader help so that we know the meaning of the words, okay? So the first time is back in verse 38, okay? Where he's... in verse 38, turning around, Jesus saw them following. He saw Andrew and John following and asked, "What do you want?" And they said, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" So the first translation he helps us out with is this word rabbi. And he says that really means teacher. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, we see the next time is in verse 41. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah." And then he gives us the translation. That is the Christ. Okay? So he gives them another Jewish word and tells them that means Christ, which is the more common Greek word. Okay? And then the next time we see it is at the very end of this section, the last part of verse 42, where Jesus looks at Simon and he said, "You are Simon the son of John, you will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. So the third episode is the apostle wants us to be sure that we understand that Cephas means Peter. Now why does he do this? That's the question. Why does he provide this in the text? And it's important that we see a reason for this. First of all, when he says rabbi, rabbi was a word that was also a title. But you know what? Titles over time kind of lose their meaning. And let me give you an example. A word we use in our society all the time is a word doctor. But do you know what doctor means and where its origins are? Doctor means teacher. And the origin of the word doctor goes back to when anyone who was called a doctor was someone who taught their art to a succeeding generation. Okay? But now, doctor just really means, in many regards, just somebody who's studied a lot or who has gone through a lot of academic preparation. It really has nothing to do with them passing that information on to the next generation. And so that's actually the same point that's being made here, is that the apostle wants to be sure. See, a lot of the readers at the end of the first century, a lot of the readers are not Jewish. They don't understand what a rabbi is. They know that they call people rabbis over in Palestine and in the Jewish traditions, but they don't know that that means specifically teacher. And so he wants to be sure that they understand that Jesus, in accepting this title of rabbi, was a teacher. He was all about changing people. He was all about bringing insight to people. And so that's the point of this, is John the Apostle doesn't want us to miss that and think that was just simply a title that really had no bearing in reality. No, John says he wasn't just somebody who was important, he was a teacher. Okay? Then we see the next time this word Messiah. Okay? And he wants to be sure that they are going to make the connection between Messiah and Christ. And I suspect that I think that the reason for this one kind of is almost backwards from the previous one. By the end of the first century, people identified the person Jesus Christ as having been a historical figure that lived in Palestine. But it was almost as if Christ, in this case, had no meaning. It was more of, that was his last name, or that, so they thought. And how many people in our world think that? But in reality, the word Christ has a meaning. The word Christ has an important meaning. It is the meaning of the word Messiah. It is the meaning that points us to recognizing that Jesus was anointed. And so at the end of the first century, the Apostle John wants people to see that Christ was not just his last name, that Christ was telling us about him, that he was the Jewish Messiah. He was the one the Jews had been seeking for centuries, and he fulfilled the purpose of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, and so in using this technique, by telling the people that we have found the Messiah, that is the Christ, he's bringing those two together so that they recognize the importance and the significance of the name Jesus bore. Okay, and then in the third case, and this is kind of similar, we see his name being, Simon's name being changed to Cephas, which was also called Peter. And what the author doesn't want us to miss there is that this word Peter had meaning. Okay, and this is like anybody with a last name of Smith. At one time, that meant something. It meant the occupation of that family, of the head of that family. If your last name was Baker, if your last name was Miller, those were descriptions of you. They weren't just names. And the same thing is true here, that Cephas, he wants to be sure they understand that this means Peter, and they would know that the word Peter meant rock. And so they would see the connection. And now that sets the stage for the incredible growth that occurs in this man Simon as he becomes the rock and as he fulfills the changing of his name. Just as so many Old Testament characters had their names changed. And then they fulfilled those roles in various situations and various forms. So that's one thing I wanted you to notice here that we didn't talk about last week was the technique that the author uses in this interpretation of names. Right. Okay, and there's one other. This is a bit of a sidebar, but I want to bring it out. It's a little bit, as I said, it's a little bit technical. But I want to ask you a question. On day 3, in this text, between verses 35 and 42, can you find any evidence of a 4th disciple being made? Take a minute and take a look through here and see if you can find any evidence of a 4th disciple. Well, my guess is probably not. And this may all be conjecture, but there is an important point to be made as we look at the process of interpreting the Bible and reading the Bible. Some have guessed that there might be a 4th disciple made on day 3. And it comes from verse 41, which reads in the NIV, "The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon." Okay? You take that phrase and you look at that phrase and you think, there's no room for a 4th disciple there. This is just talking about the people we already know about. We've got the evidence regarding Andrew, we've got the evidence regarding John the Apostle, we've got the evidence about Simon. However, if you look at the original text, and in Greek, the text simply puts the words into a sentence. And you can't always tell which word relates to which part of the sentence. Okay? So if you look at this in the order of the Greek text, here's what it says. Verse 41 in the original text says, "Finds this one first his brother." Finds this one first his brother. Now, one way to interpret that is the way that the NIV has done it. And they say that the word first means that Andrew, the first thing he did was to go to find his brother. Okay? That's the way the NIV looks at it. But there is the possibility in this text that Andrew going to find his brother Simon was the first of two men going to find their brothers. Okay? So the NIV attaches the meaning to the word first, but it may not be the only meaning. All right? There might be another role for it. There might be another meaning to it. And if there is another meaning to it, it could mean that the Apostle John also went to find his brother James, who also becomes an apostle and in fact becomes the first Christian apostle martyred in the book of Acts. So it's ambiguous. We don't know the answer to that question one way or the other, but in verse 41, the text does allow for that possibility that the word first may be referring to the first of two brothers, or of two men going to find each of their own brothers. All right? Rather than, as the NIV has described it, the first priority for Andrew. Now, why might this be significant? Well, here's why it might be significant. It's because, and I'm not saying that this is significant in terms of affecting our faith one way or the other, but it does tell us something about our processes of Bible study. And we have to recognize that quite often the translations that are more easy to read also have an element of interpretation built into them so that we can read them more easily and so that in English we can understand them. But sometimes they can close off other meanings that might be lurking in the background and could be significant. So I guess the take-home message that I would encourage is that it's a good idea if you're going into Bible study in depth, in detail, it's a good idea to not only use an easily read translation like the NIV or the ESV or many of the others. I would also encourage you to have one of the more literal translations that you can work back and forth from. And the purpose for that is just to leave your mind open for alternate meanings that sometimes show up. And what are some of those more literal translations where they're going to be harder to read? So you're looking at things like the King James or New King James, the American Standard or the New American Standard. That honestly is my preference, as either American Standard or New American Standard. And when I'm going into detailed study, those are the sources that I tend to consult. But that's the reason for it, is because at times the more easily read translations can steer us in a direction that the text may not require. Okay? All right. Enough about day 3 and a few sidebars. We come next to day 4. And day 4 is verses 43 through 51. Okay. And this is the call relating to Philip and then Philip's apparent friend Nathanael. Now this time, remember that last week we talked about some of the differences between day 3 and day 4. In day 3, John the Baptist provided the initial introduction between Jesus and those two who would become his disciples, Andrew and John the Apostle. Okay, and it was John the Baptist that pointed them towards one another. But on day 4, John the Baptist is no longer here. And we see right off the bat that Jesus is the one who initiates the call for Philip. And we read that in verse 43. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. He found Philip and he said to him, "Follow me." Now, Galilee, I'm going to go back to a map that we had several weeks ago. Galilee is up in this region, the north. We talked about the possible locations for the wilderness site of John the Baptist ministry, and here are the two that are most closely identified. At any rate, on this day 4, Jesus decides, okay, we're going to head to Galilee. So we're going to go north, and we're going to head up to this region in the north surrounding the Sea of Galilee. Okay, and most of the commercial activity up there surrounded the Sea of Galilee. The importance of the Galilean region was that this was not only a center of fishing trade particularly, but also trade routes came across this area. If you were coming from the north or the west, the trade routes sort of followed down along the coast here on down to Egypt. If you were coming from the east and the area of Assyria, Syria, Babylonia, in that area, Persia, those areas, the trade routes sort of came across this way, and then they crossed through Galilee and joined what's now called, I believe, the King's Highway, which runs down the coast of Israel. But those trade routes were very important, and that's part of the reason that when we see things going on in Galilee, we're much more aware of Greek culture for that reason. If you get down in Judea and Jerusalem, that was all just Jewish. But up in here, there's so much influence from other nations coming through that there's a lot more Greek influence. There's less direct control of the region by the Sadducees and the Pharisees and things like that. So Galilee is a little bit more progressive on the political scale in the first century. All right, so Jesus makes a decision on day 4 that he's going to start heading up towards Galilee. And of course, we know that by the time we get to chapter 2, he's going to be in this town of Cana for a remarkable event, okay, and the first of his miracles. Okay, so he starts to head for the Sea of Galilee. The text does not tell us where he finds Philip. The text does tell us in verse 44 that Philip was from the town of Bethsaida. okay, which is up here on the coast of the Sea of Galilee. And not only was Philip from there, but Andrew and his brother Simon Peter were also from that same town. And so Bethsaida, in all likelihood, was a small fishing village along the coast of the Sea of Galilee, and somewhere between the wilderness ministry area of John the Baptist and Jesus' destination in Galilee, he meets up with Philip. All right. Now we're going to also meet a guy named Nathaniel before very long. And this text does not tell us where Nathaniel is from. But if you look, and I'm not going to read it right now, but if you take a look in John chapter 21, verse 2, Nathaniel was from the town of Cana. Okay, so this is all falling in line as Jesus is deciding that he's going to work towards Galilee now. And ultimately, by chapter 2, he's going to be in the town of Cana. So, the text tells us that he found Philip, he said to him, "Follow me," and we don't get any further discussion about what happened from that point on. We don't know if Philip was a disciple of John the Baptist, or if he was just raised in the synagogue in either Capernaum or Bethsaida. We just don't know any further background on the apostle Philip. But it does tell us that Philip found Nathanael. And it appears that Philip and Nathanael may have been buddies. Now, a lot of people have wondered, who was this Philip? And the answer is, or who was this Nathanael? And the answer is, we don't know for sure. But there is some thinking. I'm just getting back here. Here we go. Nathanael may have been Bartholomew. Because Bartholomew's name is always linked to Philip's. And whenever you see a list of the apostles, Bartholomew and Philip are always right next to each other. And then church history tells us that Philip and Bartholomew did a lot of their ministry in the first century together in various areas. And we'll talk about some of that later on. But there's a good chance that this Nathanael was also known in the Bible as Bartholomew. Okay, so let's work our way through the text here. And basically, Philip talks to Nathanael about what he has learned and who he has met. And here we start out in verse 45. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We found the one Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And so this sounds remarkably like what we heard last week, where Andrew goes to talk to his brother Simon Peter, and he says, "We have found Messiah." And now Philip goes and he finds Nathanael, and he says, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Now, Nathanael was kind of skeptical at the beginning. And the reason was because he says, how can anything good come from Nazareth? In verse 46. Nazareth was just an out-of-the-way, sleepy village with really no significance other than Jesus grew up there. And so that was the limit of their reputation. And Philip, when he talks to Nathanael about this, Nathanael is kind of doubtful at first, okay? Then, what does Philip say? Well, that phrase that we talked about last week, come and see. You know, here's what can help you overcome your doubt. Come and see. Come and meet him. See for yourself what I'm talking about, right? And see what you think, okay? And so we see then this interaction occurring between Jesus and Nathanael. Starting in verse 47, when Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, "Here is a true Israelite, in whom there is nothing false." "Well, how do you know me?" Nathanael asked. And Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree, before Philip called you." And then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." Okay, So the interaction between Nathanael and Jesus begins with Jesus making a character description about Nathanael. He says, here is an Israelite in whom there is nothing false. This man is genuine through and through. And it was a commendation, really. This man, Nathanael, is a serious Jew with integrity, is what he's saying. And Nathanael has to wonder, how can he possibly know that? Well, it's interesting because just a few verses earlier, we saw last week that Jesus made the same sort of character assessment of Simon Peter. He saw it from the very beginning that he would be the rock, and he went so far as to change his name. So now he sees Nathanael, and he sees right through him to see his character. And remember, the Bible tells us that God looks on the heart, right? Man judges by the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. And Jesus is showing us that he has that capability as well. He can see to the intentions and the thoughts of even our hearts and the things that we try to hide. Okay. So Jesus gives him this high compliment, and Nathanael says, how'd you get that information? How do you know that? You guys been talking about me? What's going on here? And Jesus said, no, before Philip even went to find you, I was aware of you. I saw you. Now, we don't know what this means about, I saw you under the fig tree. There's been a lot of things suggested to it. And I'm just going to throw them into two main categories. One thought is that Jesus was able to physically see Nathanael, and the fact that he was sitting under a fig tree, even though he wasn't visible to Jesus by normal physical sight. So could there have been some sort of a miraculous element, or even just that in some way Jesus noticed him? All right, that's one possibility. The second possibility is that Jesus did see Nathanael, and he noticed him, and he saw through him. He perceived who he really was, even though they hadn't even been introduced yet, and even though Philip hadn't talked to him yet. So either one of those are possible, but the important thing is that Jesus is able to assess the depth of Nathanael's spirituality before he's even brought into the picture and before he even meets Jesus, before they ever meet one another. Nathanael's response, he says, you are a rabbi, and recall what we just remember from last week, that means teacher, one who is trying to impart knowledge, impart wisdom, impart direction, who's trying to affect and influence people. That's the first title that comes out. That's the first thing that comes out of Nathanael's mouth. Then he says, you are the Son of God. And he closes by saying, you are the King of Israel. So you are the Son of God. You have the standing with God that the Messiah should have. Just like Philip had told him earlier, this is the one that Moses and the prophets have been talking about. And he also says, you're the King of Israel. You're the one who will sit on David's throne. You are the fulfillment of the promise made to David that his seed would be on the throne forever. So all of these things, Nathanael can see them all coming together in Jesus. And once again, we have an eyewitness identifying who Jesus is. Okay, we will go on a little bit further here as we close this section out. We can read, Jesus makes some additional comments to Nathanael, and these become very, very significant. This is verses 50 and 51. Jesus said, you believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You will see greater things than that. Okay? You will see greater things. Okay. This thing is just getting started, Jesus says. And even though Nathanael has just said, "You are my teacher, you are the Son of God, and you are the King of Israel," Jesus says, there's more important stuff than that. You're going to see, you're going to learn what that really means. You have an understanding now of what those things might mean, but you're going to see greater things than that. Okay? You're going to have special experiences. And then he goes on in verse 51, and Jesus adds, "I tell you the truth, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." All right, so there's greater things coming. We're going to see heaven open. And we're going to see angels up and down, ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Well, the first part of that's pretty easy maybe to understand. You'll see the heaven open. And what Jesus is telling him there, of course, is that you will have direct access to heavenly scenes and to heavenly things and to heavenly ideas, because Jesus himself is going to show those things to us. He's going to show them to Nathanael, but just as Nathanael gets those things shown to him, we as readers are going to see heaven open as well. We're going to see Jesus revealing the things of heaven. Okay? And that's the immediate interpretation. Of course, the ultimate interpretation, the ultimate fulfillment is that picture of Revelation, where a new heaven and a new earth are available and seen and in existence, and we all live there. And heaven is open to everybody. So there's as we've learned so adequately from Paul's discussion of the book of Isaiah, we once again see these statements being fulfilled in 2 or 3 different periods of history, and each one becomes richer than the one it was built on. So we see that in this phrase, heaven open. I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven open. Okay? But the rest of this might seem a little bit confusing. He says, you will see angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Okay? And can you think of any Old Testament ideas that might be building upon? We'll turn over to Genesis chapter 28. Because this is a direct reference and fulfillment, in a way, of what Jacob, the father of the nation of Israel, experienced. Chapter 28 of Genesis, starting in verse 12. Well, we'll just read verse 12. He had left Beersheba and set out for Haran, and then in verse 12, Jacob had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. So there's a definite similarity here between the dream that Jacob had experienced when the promise of God was repeated to him that his children would become a great nation, they would have great land, and that through all nations of the earth, all nations of the earth would be blessed through his seed. But there are some. It's just like what we were talking about earlier when we said there's some things that are similar and there's some things that are different here. We see in both the dream and in what Jesus says in John chapter 1 that the angels are ascending and descending. In other words, they're communicating between earth and heaven. Okay, but the difference is that in Jacob's dream, they were going up and down on a ladder. In Jesus' prophecy here, he says, you will see the angels ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. And of course, the Son of Man is a reference to Jesus. And so Jesus here is claiming to be the fulfillment of the dream given to Jacob 2 millennia before that. And he's claiming to be the ladder upon which communication will be established between heaven and earth. And that is what Jesus is claiming. Let's read it one more time so you can see that. Jesus says in verse 50, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You will see greater things than that. I tell you the truth, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." And then there's, in addition to the passage from Genesis, that was Genesis 28:12. There's one more verse we need to take a look at from the Old Testament. This is Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Because that's where this terminology, the Son of Man, comes from. And indeed, that's the most commonly used title that Jesus uses for himself during his earthly ministry, is this title, the Son of Man. So let's just quickly take a look at where that came from and what it meant. Look back in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. This is the vision that Daniel had. And he writes, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." This is a description of who the Son of Man was and what his role would be. And what this tells us about the Son of Man was, there's 4 key things. I'm not going to write them down. First of all, his origin was from heaven. He came from heaven. He lived in the presence of the Ancient of Days. His authority was from the Ancient of Days, from God himself. That's where he gained all of his authority and his power to direct events. His kingdom would be a universal kingdom. It would include all peoples, all places, and would be encompassing all of time, all of human time. And so the 4th thing would be that his kingdom would also be everlasting. So we have those 4 important qualities that relate to Jesus calling himself the Son of Man. The Son of Man was prophetically supposed to originate from heaven, get his authority from God. He was going to rule. He was to rule and bring a universal kingdom which would last forever. And so those were the 4 critical elements. Let's close today by reminding you that the author of this book, John, is inviting us in with the story as well. And so as Jesus speaks these words to Nathanael, let's imagine that he's speaking these words to us in the same way. And he's telling us that we are going to see heaven open. As we follow Jesus' activities through the rest of this message, we are going to see heaven be opened up as well. We're going to be seeing through the heavens and seeing the picture of God and what he looks like. And it's going to be a remarkable experience. Jesus has now been established as the Messiah by his eyewitnesses. There are several that we have now identified. We have learned that Jesus is the Messiah as seen by John the Baptist, as seen by Andrew, as seen by John the Apostle, as seen by Simon Peter, as seen by Philip, and as seen by Nathanael. Okay, and not only have they recognized it, Jesus is now claiming to be the Son of Man. So, as we said, beginning on day 1, that our target and our vision was initially of just John the Baptist. Now it has swung all the way around, and John the Baptist is off on the side now. The guy on center stage at this point is Jesus. And the Apostle John is pointing us to him, and greater things are ahead for us. And indeed, in our next class, the great thing will be his first miracle and the wedding feast at Cana. So let's be excited. Let's look forward to what the apostle is going to recall for us and what he's going to show us and what he's going to teach us about his King and ours too, Jesus Christ. Don't forget, God is good all the time.